Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. With Lent coming up, I wanted to talk about the idea of asceticism a bit. For those who aren't familiar, within Lent, there are various ascetic practices. Catholics tend to have it relatively easy with fasting on Friday, on Good Friday and Ash Wednesday. And by the way, when I say fasting, I don't mean strict abstinence from food. There's a particular thing. It's one meal within the day, and two small snacks are also permitted. For various historical reasons, it's got purposes. There are people who are more hardcore, like Muslims during Ramadan. They have a strict abstinence from food and water from sunrise till sunset, for example, which is a different thing. And the Orthodox are generally, I think, at least in America, more hardcore than Catholics, with fasting, I think, on every Friday and abstinence from meat during all of Lent. Whereas Catholics only tend to have abstinence from meat on Fridays, except for Good Friday, which is a day of fasting. So, there are different practices. There are other churches. I'm not sure what various Protestants do. And you'll also have heard of the idea, I think, if you're in America, of giving up something for Lent. Where it's a special practice. There's no particular prescribed thing, but a lot of people will give up candy for Lent or something like that, especially younger people. Different things. People have different ideas. So I want to talk about what asceticism is, because these are all ascetic practices. Different from aesthetic, by the way. Aesthetic refers to like the whether or not something is beautiful or pretty or nice looking. Ascetic refers to, well, what I'm talking about, which is the practice of going against our natural inclinations, which is to say exerting mastery over ourselves. So, for example, asceticism might be something like not drinking when you are thirsty, or not eating when you are hungry, or staying awake when you are tired. There are other things, but the whole point of asceticism is that, our body has impulses by which essentially it communicates to us that it has needs. But, and here's the really big but in these things, that information is not, in general, like a do or die sort of information. When you start to feel hungry, you are not going to starve to death in the near future. In fact, for most Westerners, we tend to live in with a great deal of plenty in terms of food. Most of us, not literally everybody, but most people. There are very few Westerners who are a few meals away from starving to death. Most of us could go weeks without food and not be too badly off. Some of us could go literally months without food and not be too badly off, micronutrients and stuff aside. Water's a different matter, which is why nobody fasts from water for any great length of time. And by nobody, I mean almost nobody. There are some people who thirst themselves for several days in a row. You start getting into some interesting hallucinations, as I understand it, which is actually, I think, why those people do it. That's not connected to the Christian practice. I'm just noting there do exist such people. So but again, with being tired or with being thirsty or various other things, simply that we're attracted to fun, these are all things which are in themselves good, but for which we, in general, being fallen creatures, have a disordered relationship to these things that our body communicates to us. That we tell, we feel that we are hungry, and we put a vastly overdone amount of importance on this. We attach far too much importance to I'm thirsty, I must drink right now, or things like that. And so the idea of asceticism is not a rejection of these various bodily goods as good, because they are good, but rather a rejection of them as masters. So the idea being, essentially like with regard to food, I will eat when I choose to eat. I am not going to be a slave to whether or not I feel hungry. It's not the moment I feel hungry I'm going to leap to my stomach's bidding and go do whatever it tells me, but rather I will take note of this useful information and I will act on it when this seems appropriate to me to do so. So this is a proper ordering of the human being where the rational faculty is in control of the appetites. And so that's how things are supposed to be. And when done that way, everything works. The rational faculties do properly take note of the body's needs and provide for it according to its needs. So there is no idea of like starving yourself long term. In point of fact, the reason why and the Catholic version of fasting. And I think this comes from the Jewish practice of fasting too. I'm not sure about that, so don't quote me on that by any means. Look that up if you want to know. But the idea of having one meal during the day is that you do keep up your strength for working. It's just that rather than eating at the most convenient time or the time particularly when you're hungry, you work during the day and then at a time of your choosing, you go and have a meal. And you have a meal suitable for sustaining you. The idea is not in general that you then have, like 3 meals all compressed into one, but one meal suitable to the amount of work you are doing, which would be a fairly large meal for, like a peasant who's, working by the sweat of his brow. Although I will note peasants tend to be, something worth noting is that peasants tend to be farmers, historically speaking, and they would tend to have their heaviest, work seasons in the spring and in the fall, not so much around here. Basically when it's time to plant things and when it's time to harvest them, are the really big times for working, not so much other times. But in any event, the point is something appropriate to what you're doing, rationally ordered to what you're doing, is what you would be consuming, but at a time of your choosing, such that you are overcoming our general habit of being more slaves to our appetites than we should be. Now, another way of thinking of asceticism is like spiritual exercises. For example, fasting you might think of as like spiritual push-ups. Because while normally speaking, as in the West, we tend to be able to, in the rich, affluent, modern West, we tend to be able to have food whenever we want. That's not always the case even in the West. Every now and then, for whatever reason, things don't work out for you to actually have food. And your body notices this and various things change. You can have, instances of people refer to as low blood sugar. I don't know if that's the actual physiological cause. But in any event, various things can happen to people, especially who are used to have a very carbohydrate-heavy diet, who then go without food for a while when they don't expect to. It can make people very crabby, that is to say, grumpy and unhappy, very quick to snap and become angry at people. Now, if you practice this sort of thing, practice feeling like you are hungry, practice, going without food and having your body yell at you like, I'm hungry, I really need food, and, practice saying, okay, but not now. Then dealing with that, and especially at a time when, the rest of your life, you don't have too many stressors coming in, this gets you used to that. It gets you used to experiencing that. And one of the things, anyone older will be familiar with this. But, for example, pain is a highly relative thing. Like there's this joke of, two old men in their 90s in the nursing home. And one says to the other, how are you feeling today? And the guy says, normally I would say good. If I felt like this when I was 16, I'd have said I was feeling horrible. Which kind of gets the point of, the more you experience, the more you become familiar with it and not scared by it. You can call it jaded, but more properly, if you've experienced a lot of pain in your life, you have a good sense of what is the pain actually telling you? How bad is this pain actually? I experienced this recently, going on a hike with my son. We were, 7, and we were going on a hike, and he ran to a thorn bush and got a scratch. And he was really upset by it because he was just utterly unfamiliar with this, didn't know what it was like. And I was reassuring him, it'll be fine, don't worry about it. In fact, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you'll forget you even have that scratch. And he didn't really believe me at the time, but he sort of took my word for it. And then asked me about it. I explained, I've been scratched by thorn bushes hundreds of times. I just, that much experience and you get used to it. So the same thing goes for these things like deprivations or frustrating our natural impulses, like being hungry or being tired, anything that ascetic practices are related to. By getting practice with them, feeling what they're like, we feel the limits of them. We feel, how much they're actually a problem. And so this way, if we ever have to do these things not of our choosing, we're already familiar with it. So rather than turning into a person you don't want to be anywhere near, we can be in control of ourselves, deal with the situation calmly, and be not particularly the worse off for, whatever inconvenience or pain or whatever we're going through. So, basically, that's the purpose of all ascetic practices. They are like, in the same way that exercise is doing hard things, so when there's some hard thing you actually have to do, you'll be able to do it well. This is the same thing. It's like exercising. It's getting used to the trials and tribulations of life such that you can be in control of yourself and good at dealing with them. So, religions do these because religions largely are about people becoming better, but ascetic practices, there's nothing particularly religious about them. There's nothing particularly religious about not eating for a bit. It's just a matter of learning how to rationally control yourself like you're supposed to. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. With Lent coming up, I wanted to talk about the idea of asceticism a bit. For those who aren't familiar, within Lent, there are various ascetic practices. Catholics tend to have it relatively easy with fasting on Friday, on Good Friday and Ash Wednesday. And by the way, when I say fasting, I don't mean strict abstinence from food. There's a particular thing. It's one meal within the day, and two small snacks are also permitted. For various historical reasons, it's got purposes. There are people who are more hardcore, like Muslims during Ramadan. They have a strict abstinence from food and water from sunrise till sunset, for example, which is a different thing. And the Orthodox are generally, I think, at least in America, more hardcore than Catholics, with fasting, I think, on every Friday and abstinence from meat during all of Lent. Whereas Catholics only tend to have abstinence from meat on Fridays